Good evening. My name is Rasmus Nielsen. I'm the director of the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism here at the university. Our mission is to explore the future of journalism worldwide. We do that working with journalists from all over the world. We do it by working with editors and executives from the industry. And we do it by doing research, where we try to bring independent evidence to bear on the big issues facing journalism, news media, and the societies that rely on them all over the world. Tonight, I hope you are all here for the 2020 Reuters Memorial Lecture. If you're not, this is a good time to consider your location. It's my great pleasure tonight to welcome Rebecca Corbett, who will give the 2020 Reuters Memorial Lecture under the title of Truth and Consequences, Harvey Weinstein, the Me Too, and the Future of Investigative Journalism. Just a brief word of introduction before I hand it over to Rebecca. She started her career as an assistant editor at the Waterville Morning Sentinel, a small local newspaper in Maine that I'm pleased to report is still going. She now leads the investigations department at the New York Times, where she has edited and overseen the Times reporting on some of the most important stories of our time, the NSA wiretap revelations, WikiLeaks, Snowden, and of course the investigation that brought down Harvey Weinstein. He is not the only powerful man who has been brought down in recent months. We have also seen in the US alone, Bill O'Reilly from Fox, Les Mamis at CBS, Matt Lauer from NBC, Charlie Rose at PBS, Mark Halperin and MSNBC, and others leave their positions. Across the world, journalists and others have tried to hold other powerful men to account for their actions within the media industry itself, from Carlos Sousa in Mexico, to Shiro Ito in Japan, to Priya Ramani in India, to Sophia Huang in China. None of this is easy or simple, which is just another reason to welcome tonight's lecture. The work that Rebecca oversees at the New York Times, I think, is a powerful reminder of how investigative journalism can help hold power to account when it documents with precision, with specificity, and with documentation that someone is violating the public trust, or in other ways, legally or ethically acting in questionable ways. And we've seen that power with the Weinstein story even before a jury convicted him of felony sex crime and rape, February 24th, last week. So tonight, we will learn more about all the work that goes into holding power to account by seeking truth and reporting it. So please join me in welcoming tonight's speaker, Rebecca Corbett. Welcome to Oxford.
Thank you very much. I'm very honored to be here tonight. Just a week ago, Harvey Weinstein was convicted of rape. The outcome of the trial was by no means a foregone conclusion. His accuser's stories were complicated, and the defense seized on those vulnerabilities, arguing that the Hollywood producer was the victim of a backlash against men. While allegations against Weinstein set off a global reckoning about workplace sexual harassment and abuses, the legal case against him was a narrow one, centered on two women. But the trial inevitably took on a larger meaning. After the verdict was delivered, many of Weinstein's accusers reacted with relief and tears. Lawyers called it a risky, boundary-pushing prosecution that showed that the criminal justice system, which had often failed victims of sex crimes, could actually work. Women around the globe declared it a victory for the Me Too movement and for the power of speaking out. I'd like to discuss how we got here. The story of Harvey Weinstein's sexual predation, he has now been accused of misconduct by more than 90 women, resulted from dogged reporting by journalists. I'd like to step back a moment to discuss how investigation reporting really works, what it requires, and why it is more important than ever. We're living in an age when journalism is under attack around the globe, sometimes costing reporters their lives. It's also an assault on the public's right to know. The very idea of a consensus on truth is fracturing. Powerful forces, from governments to corporations to individuals, are sowing confusion and skepticism by promoting rumors, false narratives, propaganda, and hate. And the brutal economics of the industry make it harder than ever to find reliable information. In the United States, newsrooms are being stripped down or shutting down. Local journalism is under grave threat. Entire towns and cities get little or no scrutiny from reporters, so residents do not have basic information about the communities they live in or any accountability from their government leaders. And a rise of legal efforts, from whistleblower prosecutions to libel suits, aims to weaken longstanding safeguards for journalists and their sources. Investigative reporting is evidence-based journalism. It is not opinion. It is not advocacy. It is not fake news. Its only purpose is to find truth, and its only power is in bringing it to light. That kind of journalism can be hard. It can take time. It requires a variety of information, documents, data, interviews, witness testimony, visual evidence, and editorial rigor to make a compelling journalistic case. And there is almost always one person or institution, if not many, that does not want the story told, but it matters. Our job is not to tell people what to think, but to inform them about hidden information and actions that have consequence of public interest. Such stories can hold the powerful to account. They can bring justice. They can change lives. The visual investigations team at the New York Times, for instance, proved last year that Russia had repeatedly bombed civilians at Syrian hospitals and other sites, something Russia had long been suspected of doing but had denied. The journalists did so by acquiring thousands of cockpit recordings and analyzing video from the ground, capturing the voice of a pilot as he calmly acknowledged dropping his deadly weapons on the people below. Another story featured secret audio recordings that had been sent to a Times reporter, capturing doctors at an American children's hospital expressing deep concerns to their bosses about the troubling heart surgery results there. Even as the doctors were asking each other, would I have my children have surgery here? The institution continued to send more babies and toddlers to the operating room. And we showed document after document laying out financial information about Donald Trump in a 14,000-word Pulitzer Prize-winning feat of forensic reporting on how he acquired his wealth. It was an entirely different story from the one he tells about being a self-made billionaire. Instead, it showed how his father gave him hundreds of millions of dollars over his lifetime, a fortune enhanced through fraud. Over the years, I've edited investigative stories on a wide range of subjects, from abusive workplace practices at Amazon to a global industry that killed workers as they dismantled the world's discarded ships, from police abuses to lawlessness on the high seas. Reporters I've worked with have disclosed American military cover-ups of civilian deaths, Russian interference in the 2016 US election, and the Cambridge Analytica scandal in partnership with The Observer and The Guardian. I've spent a lot of time over the years in windowless rooms with reporters poring over national security documents that the government did not want us to see. Not long after I joined the Times, I edited the story of the National Security Agency's warrantless wiretapping of Americans. There was extraordinary resistance from the government. The President of the United States called the publisher and the editor of the Times to the Oval Office and warned that they would have blood on their hands if the story were published. It was, and no blood was spilled. But the story changed laws, practices, and attitudes about government surveillance in the West. It eventually led to the document leak by Edward Snowden, the NSA contractor, and later to scrutiny of the tech industry's failure to protect vast amounts of personal data that they had accumulated. Investigative stories often begin with a reporter's idea, an editor's assignment, or an intriguing bit of information. The Times maintains an elaborate tip line overseen by my department. Thousands pour in each month. Not all of them are stories, or not all of them are stories that we think are of public interest. We identify those that seem promising, distribute them across the newsroom, and winnow them down. Some tips come in encrypted messages from anonymous people. Many arrive in emails. A surprising number show up in brown paper envelopes. One, for example, contained 3 pages of a 1995 tax return for Donald Trump, which led to the story more than a year later I mentioned earlier. Another package contained a court document that led us to break the story this summer that Neil Armstrong, the first man on the moon, had died from what his family claimed was botched medical care. The hospital that treated him paid $6 million to keep that information secret. That story took less than 24 hours. The Weinstein story, though, did not begin with a tip. It began with a question. In the summer of 2017, a Times investigation revealed that Bill O'Reilly, the Fox News host, had been accused of sexually harassing women in work situations for decades, but had covered up that behavior with multi-million-dollar settlements. Within weeks of the story, O'Reilly, who was cable television's biggest star, was fired. It wasn't because Fox News was surprised by the payments. It was because he had become a liability. Advertisers had revolted, worried that female customers would turn on them. Money talked. Soon after that, a small group of reporters and editors at the Times met, asking the question, were there other men in other industries with similar secret histories of alleged misconduct? We talked about Silicon Valley, Wall Street, businesses that employed low-wage workers like the hospitality industry or manufacturers. We also discussed men about whom there had been vague rumors. Jodi Kantor, a member of the investigations team, brought up Harvey Weinstein's name. She, like some others in the room, knew that several news organizations previously had tried to investigate the Hollywood producer, but nothing had come of it. After the session, I asked Jodi to do some initial reporting, a couple of weeks or so, to see what she could find out. Megan Toohey, who would become her reporting partner, was on maternity leave, but would soon join several months later. I also asked her if there were allegations about sexual misconduct by Weinstein, to look more broadly at Hollywood. Was there complicity by others in the entertainment industry, agents, directors, corporations that own studios? How could Hollywood's casting couch culture, men offering work by soliciting sexual favors from women, persist for more than a century? Beyond Hollywood, what were the systemic reasons that allowed sexual harassment to persist? The joy of being an editor is that you can make things happen, and there's great satisfaction in that. The sad thing about being an editor is that you spend most of your time in meetings, trapped in the office. I'm looking at Marty Barron here. I survive at work by living vicariously through my reporters. I function variously as a supporter, a strategist, a skeptic, and a safety net. Editors have to push to make a story as powerful as it can be, while also pushing back to make sure the material is solid and the premise is correct. It probably helps to be a little bit obsessive as an investigative editor, though not, I hope, in a weird way. On big stories, I try to be there with reporters, sometimes literally joining interviews with story subjects or institutions that are our reporting targets, but most often by immersing myself in the material, checking in frequently, walking over after an interview and asking a reporter, "What did you just hear? Throw me some red meat." Asking questions, in fact, is probably the most important part of the job. I think about investigative stories in stages and the decision points along the way. First, is there a there? Is there something to pursue? And if so, would it be of public interest? At the beginning of the Weinstein investigation, we had no idea whether the producer had done anything wrong. He cast himself as a champion of actresses, a Democratic Party fundraiser, a feminist who joined marches, a man considered reliable enough that Barack Obama's older daughter had worked as a summer intern at his studio. Jodi began reporting in May 2017, and after several weeks had nothing usable. We did a lot of strategizing about how to build trust with potential victims, how to reach out directly to actresses to avoid being blocked by their publicist, or avoid inquiring about information that the women might not have shared with those around them. We conferred on how to write emails, make them intriguing but not scaring anyone off. Over the next month or so, Jodi heard from 3 prominent actresses, Rose McGowan, Ashley Judd, and Gwyneth Paltrow, about disturbing hotel encounters they had with Weinstein. And McGowan mentioned something really important. She had a settlement from the producer. Settlements are a way to hold perpetrators accountable and to protect victims' privacy, but they are also allowed predators to hide their histories and continue to do harm. None of the actresses were willing to consider going on the record at that point. But if Weinstein had a pattern of sexual misconduct with women in the workplace, that would be an important story. The effort, we decided, was worth pursuing. Second, is the story gettable? How would we go about the reporting? Not all stories that we have good reason to believe are true can be adequately reported. Sometimes the obstacles are insurmountable. Almost every investigative reporter I know is haunted by a story that got away. From the start, our goal was to go beyond the he said, she said dynamic of sexual harassment or misconduct accusations, relying on two people's conflicting versions of what actually is a private encounter with no witnesses. Such claims and denials often produce no resolution. Our intent was to apply the tools of investigative journalism to see if there had been misconduct and to gather an array of evidence, settlement records, non-disclosure agreements, company memos, emails, interviews with victims, witnesses, and other people who might know of any incidents to document it. Several months later, the contours of the story changed significantly. While calling former employees of Weinstein's two film companies, Megan and Jody learned about a young assistant who had suddenly disappeared from Weinstein's business more than 2 decades earlier. After trying to contact her and getting no response, Megan decided to go to the assistant's mother's house in a New York suburb. When she arrived, the former employee opened the door. "I've been waiting for this knock on the door for 25 years, she said. Megan chatted with her for a while, but the woman would not say anything about Weinstein or why she quit. She did provide an important clue, however. Choosing her words carefully, she said she'd had a business dispute with Weinstein's company and that it had been resolved. Megan realized that was the language of someone who'd had a settlement. That meant the producer might have victimized his own employees, in addition to actresses. That set in motion an intensified effort to pursue possible victims of both categories. Jody went to the West Coast and to the UK to interview women. Both she and Megan found more current and former employees. Then they found an insider, Weinstein's longtime accountant, someone who had been closely involved in the company for 30 years. He eventually shared a damning memo that had circulated among the company's leadership about Weinstein's mistreatment of women. By then, the reporters had also learned from a Weinstein advisor that the producer had reached at least 8 to 12 settlements with women he'd claimed who'd abused them, a remarkable number. The third question, is the story publishable? Many times with investigative stories, people who have information want the story to be told. They just don't want to be the ones helping tell it. As journalists, we often can navigate around that. But one night when Megan and Jody and I sat down and they presented all their evidence to me, most of which I was familiar with, I responded that we did not yet have a story we could publish, given the reporting gaps. They had done impressive work, but they would have to do more. Some women with settlements and non-disclosure agreements would not cooperate with us, terrified of the repercussions, including financial penalties or legal action for breaking their silence. None of the accusers wanted to be the first to go on the record or to be the only one named in a story. Some hoped that all of them would jump in together, an impractical option since their encounters with Weinstein reached across decades and continents, and most of them did not know one another. We could not even share the identities of each of them with others. And we didn't know the details of some of the settlements, including the identities of the women involved, the allegations they had made, or even how much they were paid. Harvey Weinstein had declined to be interviewed because we insisted that any discussion with him be on the record, which we typically require of an investigative story subject. He called the Times anyway. He reached out to the publisher and the top editor to make his case, only to be told that he had to speak to the reporters and me. Meanwhile, he had been working against us. Weinstein loyalists, either current or former employees, called some of the women he suspected might be talking to journalists, bringing up old times and asking to be kept informed if reporters reached out. One of the Weinstein callers described the Times team as cockroach journalists. The intent, it seemed clear to the accusers, was to intimidate. Only later did we learn that Weinstein and his lawyer had also hired private intelligence services, including the Israeli firm Black Cube, to try to kill our story. Achieving that would have earned them a $300,000 bonus, the contract showed. One ex-Mossad agent pretended to befriend Rose McGowan to find out what she was saying about Weinstein to reporters and in a memoir she was writing, and then paint her as a liar. The same agent, posing as a women's rights advocate, contacted Jody on the pretext of a speaking invitation. We also knew that Weinstein had hired a stable of advisors Before publication, one of his lawyers wrote an 18-page letter threatening to sue the Times. Finally, how do we write the story? How do we make a persuasive case that the evidence is strong, the conclusions are justified, the story is fair? How do we take every step to get it right? Investigative stories are a mixture of assertions and proofs, the evidence that can support a conclusion or a key finding. Every word has to be fact-checked, and every assertion has to be challenged and defended. As an editor, my role is to help make stories as strong as possible, but also to question everything in them, effectively interrogating the story and excising anything that doesn't hold up. The reporters had gathered more information that allowed us to press toward publication, while newly aware of competition from Ronan Farrow at The New Yorker. We had to present the findings of our investigation in great detail, of course, to Weinstein and allow him adequate time to respond to the allegations. His career, his reputation, and possibly his freedom were at risk. Not unexpectedly, it was a contentious process to the very end with a fair amount of drama. All the while, the top leadership had our backs. Dean Beck-Hay, the editor, had met with us along the way and was very up to speed on the reporting. He even joined in the last call to Weinstein's team to tell them that they had to get their statements with their responses to our questions to us right then. Our terrific First Amendment lawyer read every draft behind me. Just days before publication, the reporters finally got their answer to whether any of the alleged victims would go on the record for the story. All were worried about the consequences, but several said they felt a duty to speak out, to protect others. At one point, when one of the women asked Jody or Megan why they should participate, their answer was, "We can't do anything about what happened to you, but it might help prevent it from happening to someone else." Ashley Judd became the first high-profile actress to be quoted for our story, which also named a half-dozen other women. As Jody and Megan worked to write and pushed ahead on final reporting, there was another important last step. We had to vet the accusers. The purpose was to make sure nothing surprising turned up after the fact, a criminal record, previous allegations of sexual harassment or misconduct against someone else, a messy personal history. None of those things necessarily would be disqualifying, but they might have to be disclosed to readers lest they later be used as ammunition against the women and undermine the accounts of others. The effort the reporters explained to the women was to protect them and the story. As journalists at an independent news organization, we are neither advocates nor prosecutors. We have to meet standards of fairness and pursue no specific outcome or agenda other than unearthing truth and seeking accountability. The Me Too movement, which exploded after the Weinstein story ran, provided a forum for women around the world to express grievance, to speak out, to expose people they claimed had done them harm. Many of those counts were compelling and provoked action by employers, investigations by governments, attention from reporters. But they were not acts of journalism, constrained by tough standards, including getting response from the accused, and they weren't pretending to be. People often ask if we expected the outpouring that came after the Weinstein story ran and subsequent stories by news outlets the world over. The answer is, of course not. The global response showed how pervasive and persistent workplace sexual harassment and abuses are. It awakened men to the fact that the women they knew, wives, daughters, sisters, and colleagues, had endured mistreatment so commonplace that the women didn't even talk about it. It helped provoke a broad cultural consensus that women should not have to trade sex just to do their jobs. But how to address the problem is still very much in dispute. In many countries, women still don't dare speak out. Those who held low-paying jobs largely say nothing has changed for them. Even in wealthy countries, the shift in attitudes vary. Our reporting and that of others led to a broad examination of how institutions, including the criminal justice system, had long failed to protect women in the workplace. Sexual harassment and misconduct are systemic problems and will require systemic changes to be curbed. That involves everything from different criminal and civil laws to limiting agreements that seal women into silence, to enforcing corporate rules on misconduct. There's a robust debate about what accountability should look like. What kinds of offenses merit what type of penalty? Can someone who has fallen be redeemed? Harvey Weinstein is awaiting sentencing and plans to appeal the verdict. His legal troubles still are not over. He faces other criminal charges in Los Angeles. Several civil cases, including one brought by Ashley Judd, are pending, and he is yet to sign a $25 million settlement of civil lawsuits brought by some of his accusers in a class action. His defense lawyers argue that he was a victim of the Me Too movement gone too far. The case was risky for the prosecution because the two women at the center of it claimed that they had been assaulted by Weinstein but later had consensual sex with him. That type of behavior is not uncommon, according to police, prosecutors, and rape experts. But prosecutors almost never bring charges in such cases, worried that juries will find the behavior bewildering. With their verdict, though, the jury of 7 men and 5 women in effect agreed to cross a new frontier in sex crimes prosecution. It's a new day, the district attorney proclaimed after the verdict. The only journalistic verdict on the Weinstein story was one of impact. The reporting brought to light hidden harm. It provided a path to accountability, and it made it safer for women to speak out, giving the phrase, "she said," a new meaning, a chance to be heard. There will always be a need for investigative reporting, and there are many targets we know. Sadly, there will be more stories of sexual misconduct. There are already new accounts in the United States of election interference, and now as a new virus spreads across the globe, government leaders in multiple countries have withheld vital information, disseminated misinformation, and politicized science, arguably putting citizens at greater risk and inspiring journalists to ferret out the answers. Thank you very much. Which one are you going for?
Well, thank you for all coming, and thank you, Rebecca, for a fabulous talk and for all that work.
Thank you.
That was a really inspiring testament and description of what's involved. Do you feel you sit in a tradition of investigative reporting? I mean, Marty Barron's here works for a paper that almost invented investigative reporting in a modern sense. Are you conscious of that tradition?
Well, absolutely. But like I think everyone in the digital age, we're also trying to tell all kinds of stories in different ways, including investigative stories. For example, when I referred to our visual investigations team, these are people who are video and data specialists, and they pore over open source materials and do all sorts of analysis to make investigative findings. They took photographs and videos of people around the embassy where Khashoggi was slaughtered, and identified who were some of the people around the Crown Prince who were present. They found evidence of recently a Ukrainian military unit had shot down a passenger airliner even while the Iranian government was still denying it. So I think we certainly do stories that are a whole lot of words, but we're also trying to tell them in many ways to make them accessible, to make them powerful, and to try to be more transparent about the material.
Do you think it's getting harder or easier in legal terms? Is the law a settled thing in America that enables this kind of reporting, or do you feel, certainly in Britain, I think lots of investigative reporters feel it's getting much harder?
Right. Well, under the Obama administration, there were more whistleblower prosecutions and cases than the previous 5 presidents combined. Not that much has happened yet with the Trump administration, but the president himself has gone after a whistleblower at a very high level in recent weeks at the National Security Council, and then fired someone who was close to the inquiry. we have this wonderful First Amendment, which still holds strong, but there are certainly people around a lot of powerful men who are very aggressive in threatening to sue and sometimes bringing suits. Charles Harder, who was the lawyer that threatened to sue the New York Times over the Weinstein story, by the way, they never did, just filed a lawsuit against a New York Times opinion piece last week or so. And he brought down a media organization.
Helen, you've just written a wonderful book about two or three generations of feminism.
Yeah.
What do you think the lasting significance of this story is going to be?
Well, I think to pick up on what you were saying in your talk, what fascinates me is the way that the case was able to be made despite these not being, quote unquote, perfect victims. And I think that's something where our understanding of what sexual harassment and sexual assault has moved on enormously in the last 50 years. I mean, and it is a problem now. So few rape cases particularly end in prosecution, let alone conviction. There is attrition at every step of the process. And I always see the Me Too movement, unfortunately, it looked extraordinary at the time, but it was essentially an expression of failure. It was an expression of women's belief that there was no justice for them in the courts and through their company's HR policies, that the only thing they had left was speaking out publicly. And so there is a lot of discourse about whether or not it's gone too far and innocent men are being taken down, which I entirely take on board. But the point about that is to answer that is to strengthen due process. We have created systems in order for people to get a fair trial. Harvey Weinstein was entitled to a fair trial and jury of his peers. And actually the conviction that came out of that, I thought it was only a partial conviction. In a way, I thought that was the best result that could have happened because it was not about convicting him as a kind of symbolic accuser. It was about looking at what you can prove in court on the day and saying, yes, those are the facts and he is a rapist. And that was really important. And I think that's the point for journalism, is to take the miasma of sort of swirling accusations and say, what can you really prove? And your point about protecting the accusers is a vital one. There was a very famous story in Rolling Stone magazine about a rape on campus, and the story began to fall apart once it was published. And it was a horrible process for the accuser, who may well have been making completely legitimate accusations but had got memory and trauma problems. But there was no level of protection for her. And therefore now, to half of the internet, she's seen as a false accuser. And that bit is the kind of crucial bit that journalism has to bring to this. It's not what you think, but what can you prove and what can you put on the record? And also putting the context in there, right? Putting the fact of women going on to have consensual relationships afterwards, to do the work of explaining to people that that is a thing that happens.
What was so interesting, I thought, about the verdict was very few jurors have talked yet, but one who did a TV interview, and it was a man, said that in the first couple of days of deliberations, they had a lot of discussion about the very question of, the mixing of non-consensual and consensual activity, and apparently they resolved it in their minds that it did not erase, the criminal act. And this was also a majority male jury. I forget the racial breakdown, but the prosecution had complained that because so many of Weinstein's accusers were white women, that the defense struck so many white women from the jury pool. So there was a lot of concern at the outset about very lopsided jury. But the jurors took these complicated questions and they agreed that we're willing to, push the boundaries here and have a broader understanding of how, victims of sexual misconduct aren't always everything isn't clean about it. It's complicated.
But the ironic thing from that is that I doubt the accusers would have got an easier ride from a more majority female jury. We know
Maybe not.
Very
Maybe
often,
not. Right.
The OJ case, for example, a lot of those female jurors were very hard on Nicole.
Right.
And I think that that's one of the interesting things when we kind of go back to the stories that people say it's a war on men, because actually often it is women who hold women's behaviour to the highest standard and are very judgmental. So again, it's about a structure that is above gender for me.
Yeah, no, I agree.
Rebecca's talk ended on a triumphant note, but the first 5 minutes were rather depressing because she laid out a landscape
Right.
of kind of opposite behaviour, organisations that had no money and no will. And you were talking really about the death of scrutiny. Is that a picture that you recognise from?
Absolutely.
From
I mean, your speech was powerful and moving. Thank you for it. But I mean, just think for a minute. It was astonishing to find out how much energy you had to put into this story, how much time, effort, complications, just to have the prosecutor refusing prosecuting the first time, and then having the Me Too search to have him at least prosecute Weinstein again. So he's been found guilty on 2 out of 5 charges, and I find the legalese here right and inspiring. And that has been read and seen as a global resounding victory for women the world over. But that's the conversation we had yesterday. It also underlines the inequality of women and women's access to legal system all over the world. I'm based in Mexico City right now, which is barely a 4-hour flight to Los Angeles, to LA. I'll be short, the figures are grim, but 11 women get killed every day in Mexico. And 95% of those cases remain unsolved, therefore unpunished. This is the big difference. So if we think we already arrived there, my idea would be we have to use this momentum before the momentum passes to get legal changes in the criminal justice system so women feel entitled and safe to report the crimes. Not just, obviously, if you get killed, you're a number. In Mexico, unfortunately, you're just a number. But if I'm not wrong, even in the US, a huge number, 75% by some estimates, of sexual crimes will not be reported. This figure is even higher in Mexico, which is a proxy for almost all Latin America, because women fear that they will not be treated seriously, they will be now paid no attention, cases will not be prosecuted, or they will even be assaulted and raped by the officers. This is not theoretical, it has already happened.
Right.
So I think it's a resounding victory, but we should not lean back and say, okay, we did it. This is a starting point.
I think that's really vital, because sometimes when journalists are talking about journalism, they get kind of accused of navel gazing. What's the point? Why do we need to know it? But my worry about what happens with Weinstein is that it becomes seen as pushing on an open door. There were so many accusations against him. He was so obviously a monster. All of this in retrospect, and that will obscure the fact that Ronan Farrow had to take his reporting elsewhere. He couldn't get it published in his own organisation initially. You had, as you say, private investigators after you, flanks of lawyers coming in, threatening to bully you, people. And that sense of walking on a tightrope, in fact, actually only probably somebody with such a track record as Weinstein could have been brought down in his incredibly powerful position. And I don't want it, as you say, rewritten to being kind of, well, this was obviously, this was inevitable. At some point, obviously, he was going to come down, because it doesn't feel like that to me at all.
No, I agree, but I was just going to second your point that that in the United States, that sex crimes are very few of them are prosecuted. Many of those aren't even prosecuted successfully. That in the Weinstein case, there was a third accuser who was dropped from the case because there was a big fight between the police and prosecutors, and the police ended up being accused of misconduct. And the charges really were only brought because of pressure from accusers, from women's rights lawyers, from politicians who thought it would look bad if, like the governor of New York, if they didn't bring charges against Weinstein. You know, there was a lot of skepticism about the ability to prosecute him.
You talked about a story tonight of huge impact. But in passing, you mentioned another story, which I thought was an astonishing piece of reporting, which was about Trump's finances, which took months and months and months, and in a sense dropped into a void. I mean, it had no impact at all. That must be terribly soul-destroying, isn't it?
Well, I think that one of the curiosities of the Trump administration is that so much happens that it's hard to, in fairness with that story, which, you know, the people in our department that did that, it was amazing reporting. It wasn't clear what the expected outcome would be, other than, like, you know, to tell the IRS to go back and review, you know, his father's taxes, his dead father's taxes. I mean, I'm sure that there were other things that could have happened. You know, examine Trump's finances, but a lot of it was about his father. But that there are many things that are, you know, disturbing reporting and findings about, you know, activities in the Trump administration. It's very hard to get traction on them. That you know, the usual parties that would respond, government agencies, you know, investigators, don't. And so it wasn't really surprising, I think, to us that there was no sort of action that resulted from it. But that seems to be part of the landscape we're in right now. I don't know what the solution to that is.
Can I ask you a bit about the business model? Because what you're describing is something hugely expensive and resource intense. Now, your new media commentator.
I didn't read it yet, but I've heard about it.
Rather mischievously suggested that the New York Times was now a bit too big for its own boots and was becoming a sort of toxic brand like Facebook and Google. He's made himself unsackable with his first column. But nevertheless, I mean, the New York Times is in a very privileged position. But when you were talking about the death of scrutiny earlier, you're talking about newspapers who have abandoned this kind of reporting because they think they simply can't afford it. Would you be bold enough to make the case that actually you have to do this kind of reporting and that becomes the bedrock for the business model?
I mean, I think that the New York Times, we obviously cover news in, you know, 180 countries, but we believe that the stories that have impact are one of the most important things we can do to give people a reason to read us and no one else. And that requires resources, but it also seems to be what our readers, you know, clamor for. I would just like to say something about local journalism, which very much is under threat in the United States. But I have to say, it is, you know, very painful, you know, to know about all these newsrooms that have closed and papers, you know, that I was familiar with go out of business or be reduced to just a handful of people. Even as they are struggling, it is still impressive what stripped-down newsrooms that, you know, are committed to doing the best they can do with their limited resources manage to do. In the same week that Weinstein was convicted, the mayor of Baltimore, my hometown, was sentenced to 3 years in prison. She was, the Baltimore Sun at its peak when I worked there, it had 425 people in the newsroom. It now has about 90, and that's under threat with, the new ownership that is very much into squeezing newsrooms. But a reporter in the legislature discovered that story, ran it down, and produced a blockbuster story about, the most important thing you can do in community journalism: hold your government leaders accountable. The Miami Herald, even that's far smaller than, I'm sure when Marty was there, they went back and their coverage of Jeffrey Epstein reopened that case. And there are small newsrooms who are making that are making the decisions. We can't cover everything, but if we can do some high-impact journalism even with our limited resources, that's a smart decision that they seem to be making. But that's hard. It's incredibly hard because unlike, a place like the Times where I work that has, vast resources, if they are taking one reporter out of, a dozen to spend a long time on a story, that's incredibly painful. And
it's become hard. Just to give you a couple of figures, when I was appointed editor-in-chief for País in 2006, we had 280 million euros in ad revenue a year. When I stepped down 8 years afterwards, we had just 65 million. That's one thing. Second thing is, when I started in this business almost 30 years ago, which I know sounds weird because I don't look that.
It's incredible.
But I mean, because you asked before if it was getting harder to investigate because of legal issues. Legal issues are one issue, but I think companies have closed down in a way in these past 30 years, that it's so much more complicated to get to the sources, to get to the information than it was 3 decades ago. 3 decades ago, you could just pick up the phone and get someone on the other side of the line. Now, you have layers and layers of lawyers, of PR people. Companies are shielded, protected by huge amounts of money. So it's, on the one hand, it's becoming very complicated to get to the core of the story. On the other hand, we have so few resources compared to 3 decades ago. So it's a wonder that still, under these circumstances, you and others are able to produce such stories.
I'd love to get questions from the audience. So if anybody has got a question at this point, please charge in. We've got lots of brilliant editors and one in the middle there.
I actually work at the New York Times. I want to talk about Ben's article today. And actually, but no, really, he has become unsackable, I think. But I'd like to relate it to this discussion about local journalism in the States, and also a lecture that A.G. Sulzberger gave just the other day talking about the state of journalism in the United States, and whether there's a case for the Times doing more work with local investigative teams in other local news organizations. The urgency of having a plurality of views, I think we all agree with. But is there something that such a well-resourced newsroom with an investigative team like the Times, can we do more, in your view, Rebecca, to work with other local newspapers?
I think we certainly can. We are participating in more partnerships than ever before, though they're not always sort of regionally based news organizations. They're smaller startups or news organizations sort of with specialty interest. But there have been, I know, a lot of discussions about, should we take on a local project with a local newspaper. Several years ago, we did a big project where one of our investigative reporters went off for about a year and worked with a reporter at the paper in New Orleans. And they produced this really amazing coverage about, sort of failures to deal with, the rising tide. And I think that, we would be open to the right opportunities, but so far, at least, I don't think there has been a clear idea about how exactly to do this. ProPublica has a system where they basically provide cost for local news organizations to be able to pay for their own reporters to spend a lot of time on projects. And AG has also talked about us trying to fill the gaps in some of these news deserts across the country where people do not have, again, a community newspaper. But I think there's probably certainly more we could do.
Tim, can we get
Timothy Garton-Ash, Oxford University and The Guardian. You've talked about Weinstein and women and Trump and taxes. Could you say something about Trump and women? I mean, the challenge of reporting on a president of the United States who, in the view of many people, has been very much in Me Too territory in his relations with women.
I mean, what I can say is that, one of the reasons that I think that the Weinstein story resonated so much, it wasn't just because of that story. It started, sort of in recent history with the Cosby trial, where there was a hung jury, and even though, Cosby was accused of drugging and then raping a woman, then there were the Roger Ailes and Bill O'Reilly accusations. But even before that, during the 2016 election, there were nearly a dozen women who accused Trump of groping and other forms of sexual misconduct. Megan, who worked on the Weinstein story, wrote about a lot of those stories. Then later, of course, was the Access Hollywood tape. And then the subject changed because the Hillary Clinton emails got leaked. And so by the time that we published the Weinstein story, I think that part of the, this global outpouring, and of course with many women in the US, was that they were fed up that not only had many women experienced this, some sort of workplace thing, but there was, I think, a feeling that there was no other way of being heard, of having accountability, because some very prominent men, America's most beloved comedian, a potential president of the United States, escaped any prolonged scrutiny.
But isn't that one of the things that makes this hardest to deal with? Because you have to, if you take on these people, essentially you have to destroy them, you have to bring them down. There isn't really a kind of half measure. You talked about Bill O'Reilly, and the only reason that Fox got rid of him was that the advertiser pressure was so great. As somebody who kind of believes quite strongly in free speech, I do, I worry about things like that, about using kind of essentially mob tactics against someone. But the uncomfortable thing to face is that that's, there aren't any half measures. The institution of Miramax and later the Weinstein Company protected Harvey Weinstein long after it was clear that he had, gone past any reasonable doubt, I think, in most people's mind. And that's the trouble, is that until you have to smash him utterly, which I think is something that we're really reluctant to do. We find it really horrifying to see one person brought down in that way.
What's your feeling about why some of these stories land and why some don't? So the Trump story, everyone thought that was going to finish him off, and then the attention switched. I mean, just before our own election, we had the Boris Johnson tapes of the shouting through the walls, and he's got 5, 6, or 7 children. We don't know, but none of that seems to. Maybe he doesn't know, but but that doesn't seem to impact on him. People don't think of him in a way that is harmful to his electoral prospects?
I think the best thing to think about, the best analogy is with the financial crisis, and about the idea of banks that are too big to fail. And these guys end up like banks that are too big to fail. Too many people are invested in them and know that if that bank goes bankrupt, a huge amount of their investment, their reputation is going down with them. So what you do is if there is enough political pressure from outside, then suddenly they reach a tipping point, and suddenly everyone starts selling their shares in Harvey Weinstein. Like, they're getting out because they know it's going down. But until that point, you have to think of these men as essentially institutions. In the case of Donald Trump, there is a completely rotten institution, the Republican Party about it, that has no immune system left to kick people out. It just says, you're an election winner, you'll do for us. And I think to some extent that's how the Conservative Party looked at Boris Johnson last summer and said, we know there are lots of people in your own party who have strong criticisms of you, but we think you're an election winner, and that's what we want, and you'll do. And they don't want to hear anything else. And you know, they are the kind of RBS of genitals. Sorry about that.
It's a revolting image that's going to look for the rest of the evening. Yeah.
Yeah, a slightly different topic. You know, you talk about, Rebecca, that you're flooded with tips coming all over through encrypted messages or brown paper bags, and really this is for all of you editors up on the panel. My question is about, I'm sure in those that grab bag of tips, there are plenty of evidence of lots and lots of people you can take down. So then you talk about the question of what is in the public interest. And so I'd love to understand a little better how you think about what you pursue, how you measure and define public interest. I'll only just say I'm thinking about an extreme case, if you remember, from Gawker a few years ago, where they revealed that I won't mention his name, but a major media executive who was a financial executive at a major global media company was having liaisons, a married guy liaisons with a young man somewhere, and they reported on it, and it was, you know, the criticism that why this guy is just not a public figure, even though he's high level at a major media company. Why do we care? So in that context, I'm just curious how you talk a little bit how you think about public interest.
Well, I'll start with the realm of complaints about sexual misconduct. You know, after the story first broke, and we were getting so many tips a day, and the first triage question was, are they dead or alive? And we decided that we would deal with the living rather than even famous dead people, because they were not actively doing harm. And we had to pick our shots, even though, you know, we enlisted people all over the newsroom. You know, we could only take on so many. The question of what is in the public interest, you know, is a very broad question. It's what affects people's lives, what is wrongdoing, what is information that would be vital for people to know about, you know, their government or a corporation, whatever. And we try to prioritize those. Sometimes a story, you get a tip and it feels sort of narrow. We also keep a very active, we archive every single tip, because then something happens, and then we go back and see those tips we got, which now are part of a mosaic that we know about something. But I mean, there's no one clear answer. We published a story a couple weeks ago that turned out to be way more complicated than we thought it would be. It was about a feud that began between a millionaire, a multimillionaire, and a billionaire in the Bahamas that began over a driveway. It ended up involving all sorts of allegations of rape of teenage girls in the Bahamas. But, you know, the one guy had a history of allegations of misconduct. The other guy was determined to get him and threw money around at lawyers and private investigators in a way that could potentially compromise an investigation, or, you know, a court suit. A class action suit was filed. Neither of them are household names. And it took a really long time. And when we got the tip at the get-go, it was about, raping teenagers. And that seemed like an important story to pursue. And if we had known that it would take so long and would be so complicated, I don't know what we would do. But you make a judgment about what seems important.
Yeah.
Thank you. Hello, I'm Sylvie Kaufmann of Le Monde, the French newspaper. You mentioned the First Amendment, and I would like to ask you, how important was it? Could you have done this without the First Amendment?
Right.
Could you have done this without the First Amendment? I'm asking the question because we don't have this in France, and we also launched a lot of investigations, and many of them, though we had very strong elements, we never published them because we knew we wouldn't stand in court. And we even had to, I'm talking about Me Too investigations, right, or sexual harassment or rape, or of famous people. And in fact, we had to choose a criteria, which was we would mostly publish stories if a lawsuit was already done. So, that's my question. How important was the First Amendment for you?
I mean, I'm not a lawyer. I'm sure there are many lawyers in the crowd who can probably give a answer to that. I think that we could have written that story. We had so much documented evidence. He eventually was charged with a crime. It never resulted in a lawsuit against us. Yes, Weinstein was arguably a public figure, but there was never really an occasion where he could exploit that defense. If any lawyers want to disagree.
How would that have been in Spain? Could you have written that story?
I think we could. Yes, I think we could. Surprisingly enough, Sylvie, because we would have thought France as being the spearhead of freedom in Europe, we could have done the story without any.
Just explain what would have stopped you,
legitimate,
Sylvie,
complicated.
from doing that story.
No, we have the legislation in France is very protective
Of privacy, yeah.
of privacy. So, there are stories we couldn't publish.
Not bad.
Yeah.
Do you want to tell us any tonight? Ritu.
Would you ever, Rebecca, would there ever be a condition under which you would go ahead with publishing a Me Too investigation where you keep the survivors of the harassment anonymous? Because we had that in India, and we did independent investigations, and we found that what the women who wanted to remain anonymous were saying were indeed true. And we had witnesses who had promised that should the matter be taken to court, they would come and support the claims of the women. But unfortunately, when it did come to that, and we were taken to court over this, the witnesses chose to not come forth, and we finally had to, under a court notice, take down the story. Of course, take some satisfaction from the fact that we actually had the man's name out there, and hopefully things in the internet remain cached in some way or the other, things would stay there. But would there be any circumstance under which you would, if investigation is convincing, that you would publish a story keeping the survivor anonymous? Well,
in fact, the story that I just mentioned about the Bahamas, after months of reporting by two reporters, we had done our reporting independent of this effort to bring a lawsuit, but it involved speaking to many of the same girls, and who are now women. That's also a culture where there's very little reporting of any sex crimes, and there is a real sense of sort of shame about being a victim of a sex crime. And in that case, we had several women who agreed to go on the record and then backed out, in part because they were part of the lawsuit, and the lawsuit was filed as a Jane Doe lawsuit where it did not name any of them. And we had some it was unusual for us to do that, and we had some, very robust discussions about it. But because of the way the story was framed about the feud, and because there was this lawsuit, and we had reason to believe that there was also a potential investigation in the U.S., which became clear 2 days after publication, that we decided in that case we would publish the story. But it was a very unusual case.
Yes.
Rebecca, how do you help protect the mental health of your team?
I'm sorry, I can't hear you.
How do you help protect the mental health of your team, or how do you watch out for them?
I think that for the last 2.5 years, some of the women on our team have been sort of immersed in the, sort of the sexual misconduct business, and have at times found it wearing. I think that Megan went from writing about Donald Trump and the allegations against him to jumping into the Weinstein case. But we wrote over the last year some investigation that involved 3 or 4 stories about abuses of sexual exploitation of children. And the stories were done by 2 men, and while they didn't see, it was basically about how the internet is just absolutely rife with it, the black web, the dark web, and there are all sorts of ways that, people are getting around, restrictions. Some of the policies by tech companies have not really have any teeth. And so they were just constantly dealing with people involving, rape of toddlers, and really horrible, horrible acts. And they found it really stressful and really disturbing, and that's even without seeing the images, but knowing what they were. And, we offer counseling to people in the way that, we offer counseling to foreign correspondents in conflict situations, whatever is stressful. But, we're often dealing with very difficult, subject areas.
Yes, in the middle.
I just raised my voice if it takes
Okay.
long. I wanted to take it back to a conversation we were having earlier, and perhaps reiterating one of Alan's questions. When there is such a feeling that sometimes the reporting doesn't have the impact that it used to, or maybe make a difference at all, how does that affect how you think and you feel, and then you move forward with your investigations?
I think that reporters obviously like to feel that they are doing work that has an impact. And a lot of investigations are incredibly laborious, incredibly difficult, incredibly important. That usually they produce some sort of result, if only, sort of public response and reader response. But when, go back to, Alan's question about the Trump tax stories, that, I think that people are sort of puzzled about how you make a dent with stories that seem to be of broad public interest, but the environment in the United States is so politicized, so divisive, so partisan, that it's hard to break through sometimes. And I don't know what the solution to that is, but we move on to the next story eventually.
Can I press you on what because you mentioned the 2005 warrantless wiretapping story, and you're quite right to say you did publish it, but you didn't publish it for about a year, did you?
I was wondering when that question would come up.
Do you want to just talk about how, because that was obviously a discussion within the New York Times about the
Right.
public interest, and you mentioned that the publisher and the editor were both called into the Oval Office. Can you talk a bit about the discussions you had about
Sure.
the public interest then and now in retrospect, what you think about that now?
So the story began, I guess, in either early 2005 or 2004. I'm fuzzy on my dates at the moment. And it began with one reporter, Jim Risen, and then his seatmate discovered that he was working on the same story, but from a totally different direction, and they joined forces. And they had the core of the story. And there were real concerns when they went to the intelligence agencies that this was something very explosive, very dangerous to reveal. And the argument of the intelligence agencies was that even though, we were sort of saying that that there were, the NSA had these surveillance capabilities that, and there were some technical things that they were very concerned about sort of the mechanics of some of it. But the arguments were that this would alert terrorists to what the NSA was doing, and they would stop communicating in certain ways that would make it much more difficult to stop them or capture them. The editor of the paper at the time, Bill Keller, was also, this was not that far away from 9/11. And if you were the editor and presided over these attacks in New York, there was a feeling that the government had taken on some new authorities, and some of them seemed even at that time there was a lot of questioning about them, but this in particular, the argument of you could jeopardize what is one of our most important intelligence gathering methods. The story evolved. The eventual story, just when you do more reporting, it becomes richer, it becomes clearer. But in the time that lapsed, I think there was both more distance from 9/11, but there was also, I think, more understanding inside the paper that the real argument, the real problem for the government was that it was a legal debate, and that their concern was, well, what was clearly a subtext was that they might be in legal trouble because of what they were doing. It wasn't clear that they had authority to do that, but the reporters argued strongly, and I believe that we could have published the story earlier, that the threat to, that bad guys didn't realize that they could be listened on when they, used a cell phone, that was not really a serious threat. Osama bin Laden was very careful about his communications, and so were others. So I think that there were sort of high passions within the paper, and that it was a decision that was, hard to make, And I think that, Bill Keller sort of went from one position to another position over that period of time. And, the resulting story was stronger, but it took a year.
Yeah. Yes, in the red.
Hello. I wanted to ask, you stressed about the importance of protecting the accused. Is it ever unethical to publish spoken word, especially when you've got someone like Weinstein? Say the accused ends up in a defamation case or a lawsuit. How much responsibility do you take as journalists for publishing their words?
So with any story, because we cannot provide legal support to sources, to story subjects, we don't want to in any way ever look like we're inducing someone to participate in a story, there would be no difference with that sort of situation. In rare cases, our legal team will refer someone to lawyers who take on such cases pro bono. But we, just as a general principle, do not legally represent people we're reporting about.
Can I ask you a related question? Because it's something that I read Megan and Jodie's book that came out quite strongly. When you're having these conversations, you're trying to get people to go on the record. You want them to be your sources. But that sense of responsibility too, about what exactly you're exposing them to.
Right.
How did you navigate through that? About saying he might send people after you. He might, in the case of Rose McGowan, we know there were kind of dossiers about saying that she was mad, trying to ruin her Google results.
Right. Firstly, when in any story, when you're trying to persuade someone to going on the record, it's very hard to persuade someone to do something they really don't want to do, and we try to be very mindful of that. With stories that are so intimate, so personal, so painful, I think that Megan and Jodie and other reporters try to be really respectful about what people really want. But it sort of goes back to that point I was making, that a lot of times people want to help, but they're just really worried about helping and what the consequences for them can be. Some of the women ultimately came along and some didn't. But, I think we try to, and there's certainly times when sources of Time stories have gotten into serious trouble. They've lost their jobs. They have legal predicaments. They've been prosecuted. Many whistleblowers, their agenda might align with our interest in hearing their stories, but they may also be doing it for other reasons. And they're taking risks. And unfortunately, we try to be very sensitive about not exposing people to danger and being honest about what could happen. But ultimately, we have to respect their decisions both ways.
Question up there. And then...
Thanks for a great talk. You said you have to filter all the tips that come in. So it's a two-part question, I guess. How do you determine the balance between following up what are essentially individuals' bad actions or the actions of large corporations or organisations? And which do you find it's the most difficult to succeed in tying down, particularly in view of what one of the other panellists said about companies becoming less transparent over the years, so more difficult to succeed in getting the evidence?
Right. I would not say that there's a clear preference of corporations versus individuals, but we are, of course, intensely interested in what corporations do and how they behave and what they're responsible for, and have done many, many investigations on them. They're a lot harder because they're well defended, and they're not, public entities where you can have access to records, whatever, that it relies on a lot of dogged reporting. And companies potentially can have way more, effect, deleterious effect than one individual can. But obviously, if there are allegations that seem significant about a particular individual, we also are interested in pursuing those.
Thank you very much. Thank you for a fantastic talk. I want to come back to public interest. And I wondered what you felt about non-disclosure agreements, particularly in relation to issues that are not a national security risk. Would you, if you were God, would you change us having non-disclosure agreements? Would you do something about that?
Well, I think that there's obviously a huge debate about that in the US right now, and that I think that for some women who feel that there is no other way of getting recompense for some harm that was done to them, that they want it to be kept private and not have anyone know, that it aligns with their interests, then, there's reason for it. I think that that some laws that are being revised in the US are and I think this happened in California, I'm not sure about New York State, but the way that they're trying to deal with that is to say that no public corporation in the state can can attach non-disclosure agreements to settlements for sexual harassment or misconduct unless the victim wants it kept quiet. So it provides a mechanism where the victim can be the, sort of decider here. So that's sort of, a half step. There are, plaintiffs' lawyers in the U.S. who argue strenuously that no man would ever settle if there were not non-disclosures. There's obviously reasons that men do it under, the hope of keeping something secret. But there may be this sort of middle step that, feels just.
There was talk, wasn't there, about a register of non-disclosure agreements, that if you racked up a certain number, that would kind of automatically...
Yeah, I'm not sure. I'm not exactly sure how that would work, and
John.
Yes, thank you very much. Wonderful talk. Can I just come back to the issue of investigating Trump and the lack of impact? I mean, is it the fact that he has so delegitimized, particularly the New York Times, by talking about fake news, that he's made himself, and of course now he's attacking you by a defamation suit, that he's made himself virtually uninvestigatable, or does it redouble your efforts to try and get something on him? I mean, can you just talk a bit more about that?
So aside from being responsible for fake news, the New York Times is also the failing New York Times. I don't think that even if there hasn't necessarily been a huge impact from stories we or others, the Washington Post has done about the Trump administration or Trump personally, I don't think that we have any intent of giving up. He's the president of the United States. We would never fail to investigate any president of the United States if we have reason, to pursue questionable conduct. And I don't think that, that his vilification of us is unique. I think he's not too fond of the Washington Post and its owner. and other news organizations. So I don't really think that's the reason. I think it's partly, this divided country, the ability to change the subject, all sorts of things.
Do you have the contrary problem, though, which is I presume that having put on so many readers as the kind of opponent to Trump, the kind of most powerful opponent Trump really in the country, your readers would, I imagine, a large number of them would revolt quite strongly if you published a big investigation now into, say, Biden having a private email server or his taxes. They just don't want to hear you give ammunition to Trump. There must be a strong political pressure in the other direction.
Well, if you read our comments, we're attacked from the left as much as from the right, and on many, many stories. And I'm sure that it's true that part of our increase in subscriptions are from people who have strong passions about the Trump administration. We hope that as administrations go on, that we will retain those readers, but that doesn't guide our decision-making about what we cover or how we cover it.
Ed?
Well, I was thinking about the same thing. I was very interested in this impact question. I was, Helen, you said it's because so many people are invested in some of these institutions and people, and I sort of found myself wondering, well, that's probably always been the case, so it doesn't seem to me to necessarily be the explanation. I found myself asking, what has actually changed to make impact harder? And there are a bunch of things, ability to move the story on very quickly, but it does strike me that perhaps the biggest change is the polarization of opinion.
Right.
And therefore, both your kind of organization, but also all sorts of others are speaking to their own audience, and the other side just ignores it. And in a sense, the problem may be to do with the kind of hollowing out of the centre. So rather than, when I was younger, a big story of that kind would move the centre of opinion in a way which guaranteed impact. That feels much harder to me now.
I think that's very true. No, I think that's very true.
It's a depressing thought, but
cheer us up with a question.
I don't know whether I can deliver on that, but thank you so much, Rebecca. It's a very inspiring talk. Actually, post-Weinstein, one name that often comes up, and surprisingly from the left, is Bill Clinton. Several columnists have suggested maybe he should be investigated. Some of the allegations, have these allegations really not being investigated, or is it the case that investigations just couldn't establish something concrete? And if that's the case, shouldn't newspapers say something to that effect so these sort of suggestions of collusion don't come back?
I think that in terms of your last question, I think it would be very hard to be in the business of saying we investigated somebody but found nothing, whether it's Bill Clinton or anyone else. With Clinton, I haven't personally been involved in any inquiries into him. I think there's sort of a general sense that a lot of different organizations have looked into him at different times, and it's a question of what more there is to say, and I don't know the specifics of that in particular.
Yes.
To Rebecca, what would be your advice for newsrooms with much fewer resources than the New York Times to pursue stories as difficult as Me Too cases? And to the rest of the panel, why do you think there were so few, actually, Me Too stories in the European press, even in cases where actually it was European celebrities, as Plácido Domingo, who was actually investigated by an American news outlet, AP? Thank you.
I mean, I guess what I would say is, pick your shots, and if there are allegations that seem, very serious and consequential, go after them in the same, sort of documentary way that many of these cases, have been, turned into stories. I don't know to what degree you are constrained by laws, and I know the laws here, libel laws, are much more difficult. So I don't know. I can't really answer the second part of that about the.
About so few Me Too stories in European press, I can say that I'm as surprised as you are that there were too few. And I really can understand why when the first hint or the first investigation about Plaza Domingo was run, why the Spanish press, I'm based in Mexico City, so that's why I can talk more freely now, why they didn't jump on it, because it was widely known what had been going on for years. So it's difficult for me to understand what's the mood in the newsroom, why no one raised their hand and said, hey, we have a duty here to do our job. It's really difficult to explain. I can't explain it.
I know there are lots of people who still want to ask questions, but I think we need a drink. Only to forget the revolting phrase, the RBS of genitals. Haunts our dreams tonight. Thank you very much to the panel.